Hello, here we are in week 3. We're going to talk about exemplary practice number 2, which is to inspire a shared vision. Every word is important in that particular phrase. And then we'll also take a look at Robert Clinton's ministry maturing process items, chapters 4 and 5 in your book. Let's talk a little bit about assignments first. Your discussion questions, of course, are going to continue all the way through week 7, week 6 and 7. I'll just give you one, but again, this week you're going to have 2. Be sure that you respond to the first question by Wednesday midnight and to the second question by Friday midnight. And then also respond to 2 students per question. Now, that's a minimum of 2. You're welcome, hopefully, in fact, you'll respond to more than 2, and you respond more than once to the ones that we want you to enter a dialogue, basically, a virtual dialogue. I noticed that there have been times when people have asked questions of a student, and then the student didn't respond. As I said, our introductory lecture, or introductory video, basically, that this is a classroom, and so you would never just ignore someone who asked you a question in a classroom. So you want to be sure that when someone poses a question that you respond to it. I also thought it might be good if you jumped ahead to week 5 to Olson and took the leadership style profile that he has there, and those are you've got several different ones depending on where you are in leadership. Just find the one that fits you best. Take that, and then that book then becomes a resource for you and how to develop the strengths that you have in terms of leadership and how not to allow the quote weaknesses to become problematic for you. And then of course, hopefully you're working on your paper. If not, please get started this week. The last thing you want to do is wait till week 6 and then try to cram your paper in. So get working on it now. Some of you already have, and that's great. Now let's talk a little bit about vision. Some leadership experts will tell you that it's the #1 key to being a successful leader. That's, I guess, is debatable, but some people do feel like it is. And I think that sometimes we do struggle a bit, feeling concerned that we would borrow too heavily from corporate models in church leadership. And in fact, I struggle with that myself. I think we have to find that right balance. But vision is certainly, that's biblical territory for us. We're not borrowing from anybody there. If anything, corporate world is borrowing from us. We have the great story in Habakkuk. There's only 3 little chapters there. But it's the story of God having shown Habakkuk the coming judgment on Israel. And then he really basically lodges his complaint with God. God gives him a vision that this judgment is going to be short-lived. And then God's going to, in fact, judge the Chaldeans. And so, but then it's interesting to see after he's lodged his complaint, in chapter 2, verse 1, Habakkuk says, well, in other words, I know I'm probably in trouble here, but I'm going to stand on the watch post, and I'm going to look or watch, and I'm going to see what God will say to me. Now, that's an interesting verse. We do a little bit of study on it. He was on a literal watchtower, which was, of course, designed for the purpose of seeing things. And when he says, I'm going to watch, that really could be translated, I'm going to peer intently. I'm going to look out intently. I'm looking to see something. And even have the concept of leaning into it to be able to see what's ahead. And I'm going to see what God will say. What an interesting pairing of words. I want to see what God will say. Well, then God does say something. And what he says to Habakkuk is, write the vision he had given him about the coming judgment, not only for Israel, but for Israel's attackers. He says, write the vision, make it plain, so that those who read it can run. Now, the point there being that, he had a vision, God had given him one. But he needed to not only have the vision, he needed to write it down. Not only write it down, he needed to make it very plain. And the reason being, the vision wasn't just for him. The vision was for others so that they would be able to carry on life inspired by the vision that God had given Habakkuk. So we find there that the whole idea of vision isn't, it's not at all secular. It is certainly biblical. Jesus said to the disciples in John chapter 4, lift up your eyes and look, excuse me, and look at the fields. They're already white unto harvest. And then, of course, that was to inspire them to action to do something about that harvest. Leaders have the job of helping other people seeing the exciting possibilities that the future can hold for them. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we have vision. A good phrase in Kouzes and Posner that I thought was really sums it up for us is that leaders begin a journey with the end of that journey in mind, or begin a project with the end of that project in mind. There's a story, I'm sure probably most of you have heard it, but it's told about the dedication of Disney World. And of course, Walt Disney had passed away by then. And I don't remember the figure, but some well-known figure was standing next to Mrs. Disney and said to her, it's a shame that Walt couldn't see this. And she smiled and looked at him and said, oh, but he did. Walt had seen it way before it began. And I think that's what leadership involves. Leadership involves, vision involves two key essentials. You'll find these in your book. Number one, imagining the possibilities. What is it that God has out there for you, but not just for you, for the ministry that you lead, the organization that you lead, but ultimately for your part in the kingdom of God. You see it, you imagine it. And then secondly, though, you find a common purpose so that others will join you in that vision. Now, let's talk about how do you discover vision. First of all, let me say this. I personally don't think it's an easy process. Maybe for some, it's easy. I don't think, though, that we'd have such an abundance of literature about it, helping us with it, if it was something that just came natural and easily to most people. To some, it does. But for most of us, it's a journey, it's a process, it's a discovery. So Kouzes and Posner lists three aspects to that, and these are things that you'll want to know come test time. He talks about reflecting on the past. And the reason being that when we discover where God has, the birthing that God's given us in terms of our lives, our spiritual journey, when we look back and we reflect on the things that we've been through, that God has brought us through, a lot of times those foundations begin to give some focus and some direction to where we're going in the future. The second thing that they talk about is you attend to the present. You can't be so forward thinking that you're not aware of what's going on around you. There's a very, very famous story told of in the computer industry of well, now my mind is blank. One of the major companies that was so assured that personal computers would never become would never catch on, that they didn't go that direction. Well, he wasn't very future looking, but the truth of the matter is, if he would have been attending to the present, he would have seen the trend already taking place. And I apologize for not knowing that. I'll get it out in an announcement to you, the gentleman and the company. My mind just went blank on that. So number one, you reflect on the past. Number two, you attend to the present. What's going on around you right now? For example, in ministry right now, there are things that are happening in our world that we have no control over, but they are going to affect where we head in the future. And you can probably fill in the blanks on some of those things. Number three, then you begin to prospect the future. What is it that is available to you in the future? And that's where I think imagination comes in. Now, for those that struggle with the word imagination, I think that we sometimes get a little bit out of shape, and we've let the world take our words. And the Bible talks about casting down vain imaginations, but it didn't say it cast down imaginations. Paul was led into ministry through a vision. Well, that was an inner imagination that God had given him, a dream. So we imagine the future. there's a famous quote, and you've probably heard this one before too, but Albert Einstein made the statement that imagination is actually more important than intelligence. And so he obviously had intelligence, but yet he felt like imagination was more important. Let's move quickly. If we're going to be a leader, we have to be able to motivate people. And that's what vision does. It motivates people. There's two kinds of motivation. One is extrinsic, and that basically is any kind of motivation that is linked to some kind of leverage, whether it's pay. You're motivated by pay. You don't want to lose your pay. Maybe increase in pay or decrease in pay, or motivated by losing your job, keeping your job, motivated by prestige, motivated by advancement in the company, whatever. That's extrinsic. Intrinsic motivation is when something happens on the inside of somebody, and they are internally motivated to do whatever task is at hand. And of course, a good leader is able to tap into intrinsic motivation, and good vision helps that happen. So how do you do that? How do you get to intrinsic motivation? Well, you find a common purpose. It is true that every single person has vision. Every single person has dreams. And we do best when our vision helps people not just fulfill our vision. And I think that's a huge it's an invalid aspect of leadership when all we do is have our vision and we're trying to recruit people to accomplish our vision. Henry Blackaby, in his great book on leadership, in fact defines leadership simply as moving people onto God's plan for their lives. And so his whole concept of leadership isn't even about your vision at all. It's about what is God's vision in those people that you lead, and then how do you help them get on track to fulfill that. Well, I think there's both. I think we do have a corporate goal as a church or a ministry or a business, whatever it is, and we do have a vision, but people along with that have their own dreams and own goals and their own aspirations, and so you want to find that common ground. It really is helpful when we involve people in the process. If you're just pushing your vision down on people and then wanting them to adopt it, the likelihood of that happening is much less than if you've asked questions, you've involved them in the process of developing the vision, and then the vision does become their own. It's not just yours, it is theirs. And then I think another thing is, and you'll see this in Crucis and Posner, is that you communicate the significance of what you're doing. People need to know that what you're doing matters. And I don't care what it is. It could be a cleaning company, but that matters. We need to have clean places to live and to work, and so it matters. What is the significance of what you do? Another area they discussed then is symbolism and language, use of metaphor. Remember back to John 4, we mentioned at the beginning that Jesus said, lift up your eyes and look, the fields are white unto harvest. What was that? Well, he was talking about people being ready to receive the gospel, but he used the imagery of fields being white unto harvest. There's a study that Crucis and Posner mentioned by a guy named Geary that says that in his study that people use a metaphor every 6 to 25 words. Or another way he put it was that every minute we use 6 different metaphors. So it's raining like crazy. Well, like crazy is a metaphor. Or it's raining cats and dogs, etc. Those are metaphors, and we use them all the time. But we need to learn to paint pictures of where we want to go, and use of metaphor is very, very helpful. You want to practice positive communication. I put in there practice believing communication. Number one, you need to believe in yourself. And then number two, you need to believe, obviously you believe in God, but you believe in what God has called you to do. And then you believe in the ministry and the organization that you're a part of, and you want to communicate that. People need to hear that. And then you need to express your emotions. If you're not excited, people won't be excited. So you've got to learn to express your excitement, your joy, and the thrill that you have about what God's doing. All right, let's move on to Robert Clinton, ministry maturing process. He lists what he has 4, I call big picture stages. This is overarching throughout your lifetime. And they are entry and training, relational learning, and then discernment. And that all seems rather vague to me and probably to you too, but I think as you start to read it, it'll start to make a little bit of sense to you. But he breaks that down into 3 subphases that makes it much more understandable. Number 1 subphase is early ministry, second one is middle ministry, and third one is later ministry. Very easy. But in each of those, he lists some learning processes and some developmental items that take place in each of those deals. In the early ministry is the ministry task and the ministry challenge. And by that, basically, everybody had a start in ministry somewhere. How did it start? Probably someone asked you to do something. Would you be an usher this Sunday? Would you greet on this Sunday? Would you help us teach this class? Would you set up chairs? Would you mow the yard? Whatever. And they've given you a task. Then you have the ministry challenge where you now are challenged by the Lord himself. Are you willing to do this? Are you willing to commit? Are you willing to press on with this? And so you have the ministry challenge. In the middle stage, he lists ministry skills. You start to develop skills for your ministry. And then training. You start to have some kind of training. At that level of ministry, it's informal, usually on the job. I mean, typically we ask someone, would you help us teach a class? And we put them in there, and it's kind of sink or swim. But hopefully they're with someone that knows what they're doing, and it's on the job. And then also in that stage, usually there's some kind of ministry gifting test that begins to be administered, some kind of gifted discovery process that begins to take place. And then the later ministry structure, insights, and power items, having to do with ministry on a broader scale, not just teaching in my class, but what is the structure? How does this whole thing work together? What's the systemic parts of it, etc.? Clinton talks about the little big principle. Of course, this is Matthew 25, where Jesus says, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in a few things. I'll make you ruler over many. Now, that's clearly an end of time statement that Jesus makes, but I think the principle certainly applies that in the ministry maturing process, as you're faithful in teaching that class, you're faithful in mowing the grass, you're faithful in showing up on Sundays and handing out bulletins, you're faithful in the small things, that you are beginning to evidence the number one thing that God's looking for, and that is, in fact, faithfulness. And as you're faithful, then God begins to move you forward. Process items during this time are, he calls it the faith challenge. Our faith is challenged. Authority, insights. And in your discussion questions, I'm going to have you process one of these 4 items and kind of how you see that playing out in life and in ministry. And then the third one being ministry conflict, and then also ministry affirmation. I wish we had time really to spend more time on those items. In my pastoral ministry class, we spend quite a bit of time discussing this whole issue of conflict in the ministry. It's actually a very major issue. We often don't address it. Hopefully you get that in another class. So the conclusion then for Clinton is that by the end of this phase, the ministry maturing phase, which he says usually takes several years. It's not a one-time deal. It's not a short little deal. It's usually a several-year process. But hopefully by the end of that, you begin to emerge from that with a very effective philosophy of your ministry. Let me mention, I failed to mention this at the beginning, but there are 2 videos that I have up for you, one by Mr. Kouzes and one by Mr. Posner. And not required. I was going to make them required and do some questions on those, but I decided not to. We're so condensed and so packed for time, but I think you would appreciate just watching them and kind of gleaning some insights from them. All righty, God bless you. We'll see you online.